Good afternoon, everyone. This is Bassam Haddad, and I am joined by three remarkable media analysts and professors and journalists who will actually bring to us the media landscape that we observed during this very distressing moment. Our teaching today is teaching number 21, and it addresses media coverage of the war on Gaza, complicity, duplicity, accountability. We are joined by Youmans, Laila Al-Arian, and Adel Iskandar. We are very excited to be with you all. Ahlan wa sahlan. Maybe I should unmute you. All right. Thank you all for joining us. I know that it's been very difficult for people to join these events. There have been a lot of them, which is a good thing. And I know that your schedule is tight. We will take about 75 minutes to address this matter. Let me just say that this is a collaboration of 22 plus university and research centers under the rubric of the Gaza and Context Collaborative Teach-In Project. You can find all of the material that you might be interested in on palestineincontext.org, which is right above Will's head. Let me move it a little bit. All right, there we go. All of the teachings and videos are there. We also have a special page on the International Court of Justice conversations and podcasts. And we have a list of very important solidarity statements that is categorized and curated for your purview. We have as well the War on Gaza podcast, and we are soon publishing the teaching module, which will feature text and videos curated for the classroom. Let me move forward to say that also we thank all of the people that have been working behind the scenes on this project. They are the unknown soldiers that have made and make all this possible. So thank you to all of you. There are too many to mention. And with that, I will start by introducing our first speaker. But let me just say a few words about this particular event, teach-in. In 4 months, we've witnessed several media narratives, from a war on terror discourse to one that abets genocide. This teach-in will address various aspects of the mainstream media coverage of the war on Gaza in the West, in quotation marks, including traditional and new media. Our speakers will reflect on the performance of media as they navigate pressures from parent companies, editorial policies, political allegiances, and popular dissent. They will also analyze how the influential Sunday news TV shows in the United States discussed Israel's campaign against Hamas in Gaza, and I know that Will be addressing this very specifically and directly. Let me introduce our first speaker, Laila Al-Arian, who will lead the way, followed by Youmans, and then Adel Iskandar. Each person will speak for about 8 to 10 minutes. You can go up to 12 if you need to. Beyond that, you will hear my this sound. I will share just a few words about Laila. Laila is a Washington, D.C. based journalist and the executive producer of Fault Lines, an award-winning current affairs program on Al Jazeera English. She has produced documentaries on subjects ranging from the Trump administration's Muslim ban to the impact of the heroin epidemic on children, and an investigation into factory conditions producing garments for Walmart and Gap in Bangladesh. For her work, she has been honored with 2 news and documentary Emmys, a George Polk Award, Peabody Award, a Robert F. Kennedy Award in Journalism, Overseas Press Club Award, and has been nominated for 19 news and documentary Emmys. She is co-author of the book Collateral Damage, America's War on Iraqi Civilians. Ahlan wa sahlan, Laila. We are honored for having you with us. I understand that you're going to be addressing media coverage since October 7th, a monumental failure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you all. The last time I gave a talk on this topic was on the 40th straight day of Israel's war on Gaza. It feels unfathomable to say this, but today is day 125. Today, I watched a video of children in Gaza rejoicing because it's the first time they had eggs in 125 days. Today, we're seeing videos of attacks in Rafah, a tiny corner of a tiny strip where more than 1 million people have been forced to flee because they were told it was safe. But from practically day one, Israel has consistently bombed the so-called safe areas of Gaza. You won't hear about this in the mainstream US news. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are some good examples of good and decent and fair reporting. But what I'm here to talk about is how US media has largely failed its audience and what that monumental failure means for all of us. You also won't hear about Laila Al-Arian, the sole survivor of an Israeli attack that killed her family, her tiny face burned by the bombs, or the 11,500 other Palestinian children who were killed. You won't know their names. This is not, as the US media would have us believe, the Israel-Hamas war. For CNN, that perspective is even more limited. They've branded this horrifying time Israel at war. And the reason this is not the Israel-Hamas war is clear. The vast majority of those killed during the last 125 days are women, children, and the elderly, 70%. And as I mentioned, the number of children who've been killed, at least 11,500, is staggering. Months ago, when the number was much lower, 4,600, we were saying it was higher than the number of children killed in conflict zones around the world each year since 2019. Now, what I think especially makes this a monumental failure by the media is the massive disconnect between what we are seeing on our social media through apps like Twitter, TikTok, occasionally Facebook, but also Instagram, the videos that we're seeing from Gaza, the reports, the international news organizations like Al Jazeera, and what we're seeing in US mainstream or UK mainstream coverage. Now, I would say two of the biggest purveyors of misinformation are CNN and the New York Times, especially. They've been guilty of spreading some of the most, I guess, notorious examples of sensationalistic allegations, reporting them as facts. And that was the first point I wanted to raise, which is how news organizations in the US have helped shape the narrative through making and reporting unverified and sensationalistic allegations as fact. We know some of the most notorious examples: beheaded babies. This was a story spread early on in the coverage of Israel's actions in Gaza, that on October 7th, Hamas-led fighters were guilty of beheading 40 babies in communities in southern Israel outside of Gaza. Of course, this story turned out to have been completely fabricated. There's also the story that Hamas fighters engaged in mass rapes on October 7th. And a very specific example of this is an article on December 28th called Scream Without Words that the New York Times released, which is no more than atrocity propaganda. It had extremely graphic descriptions of alleged rapes and bodily mutilation by Palestinian fighters that had absolutely no evidence to back it up. In fact, as many people have shown, some of the main sources in that article, alleged witnesses, have been caught contradicting themselves constantly. One of them is a man by the name of Ross Cohen, who literally works for a mercenary group training fighters, I believe, in the Congo. Raz Cohen actually posted a selfie of himself smiling on October 7th at the same time that he claims to have witnessed mass rapes. He told one news organization that it was one woman who was gang raped by fighters. He told another news organization that it was many women and girls who were raped. So you see a person who has contradicted himself throughout actually being a main source for this article. In general, the Israeli narrative is taken as fact, while anything stated by Palestinians is viewed with suspicion, including the death toll. And then you see this sort of circular reasoning. So you see a period in which this Israeli talking point of Hamas numbers, so-called Hamas-run Ministry of Health numbers can't be trusted, being repeated, mentioned in the media as a main talking point, and then being repeated by US politicians as far up as President Biden himself. So one trend that I've noticed is that Israeli PR narratives are actually adopted wholesale and then laundered through US media. And we see this consistently. There's a pattern of this, whether it's alleged mass rapes, one week, whether it's beheaded babies, calling the Ministry of Health in Gaza Hamas run and questioning the death toll. It seems like every single week there's a new talking point that then gets wall-to-wall news coverage. The most recent example that I can think of is on the same day that the International Court of Justice said that Israel was committing plausible genocide, you see, this manufactured controversy that so-called the UNRWA, the UN Refugee and Works Agency, Relief and Works Agency, that is the main UN agency working with Palestinians, had 12 fighters, 12 employees who allegedly took part in October 7th. Another trend you see is that once these manufactured, fabricated talking points get all of this news coverage, whether it's the New York Times or the Guardian or CNN, you see it slowly fall apart. And of course, you don't see a similar amount of news coverage to make these corrections. So of course, the lie, as they say, how fast a lie can spread. And then of course, once you see it falling apart, it doesn't get anywhere near the amount of news coverage, if it gets any at all. You also see US Israeli generals appearing on US networks like CNN for hours at a time as so-called experts. You see, who is humanized and who isn't. So since October 7th, we've seen wall-to-wall coverage of Israeli deaths, including continuous interviews with victims and their families, while almost none of the far more numerous victims in Gaza, even as Gaza witnesses horror after horror on a daily basis. From Israel shooting people, leaving the hospital in terror and waving white flags, to killing hundreds in their homes at the Jadaliyya refugee camp, to reports of snipers purposefully targeting children in the ICU of a hospital. But the wall-to-wall coverage of Israel continues unabated. The only message being sent is that Palestinian lives simply don't matter. We see a similar trend in coverage domestically in the US. So there was very little coverage of a massive pro-Palestine rally in Washington, D.C. on November 4th, compared with the pro-Israel rally in December, which was covered widely. We see the same with the coverage of Israel's presentation at the ICJ, which was streamed by broadcasters such as the BBC live, when the previous day, when South Africa was presenting its case, there was no live coverage. You also see problematic framing. You see this framed as a war against Hamas, even as Israeli officials openly talk of punishing the population, committing war crimes in what looks like a campaign of ethnic cleansing. There are so many statements by Israeli officials making it clear that their intent is genocidal, from Netanyahu referring to the people of Gaza as children of darkness or Amalek, to, of course, Avi Dichter, the Israeli Minister of Agriculture, saying we're now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Even so, news organizations refuse to refer to this as a genocide, have barely covered these comments, if at all, and instead have spilled a lot of ink disputing that it is, in fact, a genocide. Then there are, of course, the stories that don't get coverage, including, as I mentioned, the aforementioned comments by Israeli officials, but also the fact that groups of Israelis have camped out, even set up tents blocking aid trucks into Gaza. There's very little coverage of the Israeli soldiers who've been posting for months now on social media evidence of their own war crimes, whether it's stripping Palestinian prisoners or destroying Palestinian homes, blowing up mosques. The list continues. You also see problematic media coverage or a monumental failure in terms of the language and tone. We know that Palestinians die while Israelis are killed. Adjectives like monstrous, murderous, savage, barbaric, terrorist, violent, sadistic, brutal, inhumane, and horrific are reserved for violence committed against Israelis, while Israeli violence is almost never attributed, let alone, you don't see these kinds of very emotive adjectives used to describe Israeli violence. Instead, Israeli violence is vague, passive, and sanitized. Even in the case of Palestinians being denied water, which we know that since the very beginning, Israel has used starvation and cut off water and electricity as a weapon of war. You see, for example, The Guardian saying that Palestinians dehydrate to death. So again, it's not attributed, it's passive, it's vague, or it's euphemistic. And, sometimes we feel like, qualitatively there's a difference, but it's not just qualitative, it's also quantitative. So there was an analysis done by The Intercept and others. The Intercept reviewed over 1,000 articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the LA Times in the first 6 weeks of the war on Gaza, and found very concretely that for every 2 Palestinian deaths, Palestinians are mentioned once, and for every Israeli death, Israelis are mentioned 8 times, or a rate of 16 times more per death for Israelis than Palestinians. Emotive terms like slaughter are used to describe the killings of Israelis versus Palestinians 60-1. The word massacre is used to describe the killings of Israelis versus Palestinians 125-2. So you see this massive disparity in terms of the type of language used, in terms of the framing. We've seen, notorious examples that have gone viral of, for example, in the UK, referring to a 4-year-old Palestinian girl who was shot by an Israeli soldier as a young lady. So we've seen this time and again that even being called children is taken away from Palestinians, as they're called minors or young lady or young man. Of course, we see what merits a breaking news alert and what doesn't. The placement of stories. So stories about Israelis who are killed receive breaking news alerts, are placed very prominently, front page. There's a breathless and sensationalist tone to it, whereas stories about Palestinian killing are neutral, detached. As I mentioned, there's no attribution. And then, of course, there's the erasure of the story of the killing of Palestinian journalists. We've seen very little reporting on the massive killing of Palestinian journalists. Well over 100 have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. We've seen the families of journalists also targeted and killed, such as Al Jazeera's Wael al-Dahdouh, the horrific killing of Al Jazeera cameraman Samer Abu Daqqa, who was left to bleed to death. Meanwhile, Ukrainian journalists were honored with the biggest awards in journalism. They were given the Pulitzer Award, lauded for their courage and dedication. I've oftentimes felt like, simply put, Palestinian journalists are not even seen as colleagues to Western journalists. It's as simple as that. What does all of this tell us? It tells us that there's massive dehumanization going on of Palestinian life, whether it's in the amount of coverage that Palestinian deaths receive, the lack of attribution, the use, the tone, the language, the prominence of stories, and of course, the fact that there's been little to no solidarity with Palestinian journalists who've been attacked since October 7th. Even the fact that journalists haven't been allowed into Gaza has received scant coverage. The ones who have been allowed have had to embed with the Israeli military. And it raises the question of what kind of reckoning will there be once all of this is over? Will there be a reckoning like there was with the Iraq War? Will the organizations like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN have to apologize, such as they did about the reporting leading up to the Iraq War? The New York Times, in their so-called apology of their reporting on the Iraq War, said, "We found a number of instances in which our coverage was not as rigorous as it should have been." I would argue that their coverage of Gaza, of October 7th, and everything that followed actually now is much more egregious even than their coverage leading up to the Iraq War, due to how long it's gone on and due to the instances in which they, it can be argued that they in fact are complicit in genocide, and the fact that they've been used by the Israeli state to launder some of their most egregious talking points and their fabricated stories. And I would say, just to conclude, that everything I've laid out actually makes an argument that the US media's credibility has been irreparably harmed, and that laundering misinformation and disinformation and fabricated stories, creates a climate in which there really is a lack of faith by viewers and readers of these organizations in the media, and a breakdown in trust.
Thank you, Laila. Let's, I have myself, I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure that others will have their own questions. Let's wait until we actually finish and then address these questions. This was really insightful and very eye-opening. Thank you. I'll introduce our next speaker, Will, who will be addressing us and will address the old dogs, old tricks, the persistence of theories for explaining why legacy media are so bad. Will is an associate professor at George Washington University's School of Media and Public Affairs. He is also director of the Institute of Public Diplomacy and Global Communication at GW University. Broadly interested in questions of transnationalism, power, and communication. His primary research interests include global news, media industries, technology, law, and politics. Will wrote Al Jazeera's Struggle in America from Oxford University Press about the Qatari news network's efforts to gain a share of the news market in the United States. Ahlan wa sahlan, William. Welcome, and we are all ears.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I do have a PowerPoint,
Sure.
and I'm going to share it. I assume everyone can see it.
Yes.
Also, in true academic fashion, I changed the title "Old Dogs, Old Tricks: Why Legacy Media Are Still So Bad." I had to add a couple so's in there because after reviewing my findings from the study that I'm going to present, I decided that one so wasn't enough. I'm going to start by actually talking about some old theories around media studies that go back to the 1980s. And I want to ask, do these old theories still apply to what we're seeing today? And then I'm going to present the findings of a content analysis that I carried out. And I've actually already published it with the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And it was a shorter version was published on responsible statecraft. So I'm going to be sharing the findings of that study. The larger sort of trajectory of media studies research on foreign policy media coverage for the past few decades has found that for the most part, U.S. news media are overly deferential to political elites, mostly meaning policymakers. Policymakers are not objective sources of information. They are strategic communicators. They're people who have an agenda, but they're like overly sourced in news media coverage. So that bias then defines sort of the thrust of media coverage on questions of foreign policy. Now, this usually lasts in moments of crisis until things happen that take away that elite consensus. So if too many US soldiers are dying, for example, if protests are becoming too big, if there's some large economic price to pay, sometimes you'll see elite debate start to happen over a policy. But it won't, news media coverage are kind of following that pattern. This research really starts with Daniel Hallen's study of the Vietnam War media coverage. He wanted to know why was this active protest movement against the war being so readily ignored by news media. And he came up with an explanation, and it really focused on sort of elite views. In the middle of this three circles, or three spheres as he calls them, is what he calls the sphere of consensus. This is where elite from different parties tend to agree on something. And when that's the case, the news media coverage is also going to be homogeneously reflective of their views. Now, when disagreement starts to happen among the elite, we see the sphere of legitimate controversy. So items can kind of move into that, topics can move into that second sphere. But then protesters, alternative media, what we might say today is like, diasporic activists, we're in the sphere of deviance, this dark red sort of sphere, and not really making it into the circles where news media are keyed and covered. A similar kind of argument was made by Chomsky and Herman in their propaganda model, which they wrote about in the book Manufacturing Consent. They describe different filters that are at work to keep the elite opinion really driving how foreign affairs are discussed. And these filters include like the ideology of owners of largely corporate ownership of news media, and that they are concerned by they don't want to lose advertising by having controversial views, for example. That's another filter. They tend to defer to expert or official sources to help explain the world, and they're people with safe political views. There's also flack, which is the power of viewers or audience members of the public to sort of put pressure back on the news media. And then also there's larger ideological paradigms like the West is great, capitalism is great, the East is suspect, communism is bad. These larger sort of ideological paradigms also act as a filter. It gets a little more sophisticated as a model under Lance Bennett when he called it indexing model. And he wrote, mass media news professionals from the boardroom to the beat tend to index the range of voices and viewpoints in both news and editorials according to the range of views expressed in mainstream government debate about a given topic. Evidence supporting the indexing hypothesis would suggest that the news industry has ceded to government the task of policing itself and striking the democratic balance. So this idea of indexing or keying, it's when news media sort of only follow the sort of bipartisan debate. So one political party and one political party, when they're agreeing on something on terms of foreign affairs, then the media coverage is expected to follow suit. And there's also a normative element to this, which is that from a democratic theory standpoint, this is very problematic. Under democratic theory, policymakers are supposed to follow public opinion, but in the indexing model, policymakers are trying to use media to drive public opinion to do what Chomsky and Herman called manufacturing consent, make consent. So these theories have not been fashionable for a long time. Supposedly, the world became much more sophisticated. The media ecology is much more complex. We have plurality. We have many different sources of information. But what I observed and what I wanted to test in my study was whether these kinds of elite driven models apply to the way that traditional news media are covering the war on Gaza. So what I did was I looked at the Sunday TV news talk shows, which are kind of, um, relics of the glorious past of television news, but are still important and influential. Shows like Meet the Press, Face the Nation, This Week, Fox News Sunday. They air on Sunday mornings. They used to be the staple show for kind of the viewpoints of the political elite. Every candidate would want to appear on them. They were just like the hot commodity of television news. Their viewership has gone down a lot, but still they generate much larger audiences than cable news. So CNN, Fox, MSNBC, although those are 24-hour news networks, they don't gather as big of a national audience as do these programs. So I studied 51 transcripts from October 8th to January 14th and identified 140 different guests. So the guests are the people who are interviewed live and can kind of say what they want to say on a subject. So if they were on a pre-recorded package that's edited, I didn't include them in this analysis. And I looked at 3 different measures. One is guest booking. So who are these guests that they brought on? What's their nationality? What's their occupation? And then I was interested in partisan valence, which I mean is by that I mean who, in terms of Israel or the Palestinians, do the guests sympathize more with in their comments? And I had a 5-point scale, which went from pro-Israeli to sort of like pro-Israeli, but also neutral to neutral to neutral, but pro-Palestinian, and then pro-Palestinian. But I kind of collapsed those into 3 different categories, which I'll be presenting my findings. And then I looked at framing. Framing is how is the war on Gaza framed? Frames are ways of discussing different phenomena that suggest different causes and solutions. Strategic framing is intended to persuade listeners. When I go through the results, you'll get to see how different keywords stand in for different frames. But usually pro-Israeli speakers will present pro-Israeli frames, pro-Palestinian speakers would present pro-Palestinian frames. Now, under the democratic ideal of media, you're being exposed to a balanced array of different views. So that's the democratic expectation. That's the democratic hypothesis. But once you look at my findings, you'll see we're nowhere close to that. Starting with who we booked as guests. Now, the vast majority of the guests in all the different 4 programs are Americans. That's what the blue line represents. Followed by the second most, which were Israeli officials for the most part, or Israeli guests, who made up about 7% of the total. So there's a big gap there, but notably, not 0 of the American guests were Arab American or of a Palestinian heritage. Which is the first clue that something was wrong here, right? And then in terms of Arab national guests, including Palestinian guests, they only appeared on 1 program on CBS's Face the Nation. And of them, only 1 guest was actually Palestinian. Hussam Zomlati, head of the Palestinian mission to the UK, was on Face the Nation. So of 140 guest appearances, only 1 Palestinian were there, while there were 10 times as many Israeli guests. But that's not enough, right? Because that's still a small number of Israeli guests overall. We can't just deduce that there's going to be bias because of this small number, 7% of Israeli officials who are expected to give pro-Israeli standpoint. So what was happening with the actual sympathy? What we find is a very alarming and overwhelming imbalance. Overall, pro-Israeli views were at least 5 times as frequent as pro-Palestinian speakers across the board. And I would add an important caveat there. When we say pro-Palestinian, I included, for example, humanitarian concerns about the suffering of Palestinians. That was the majority of what got coded as pro-Palestinian. Only 2 of all the 140 guests expressed political concerns about Palestinian liberation or Palestinian self-determination. In other words, political aspirations of Palestinians, completely marginalized. So when there were pro-Palestinian voices or Palestinian sympathizing voices, they had to emphasize, for the most part, the humanitarian dimension, which is in a way sort of disempowering, right? And that even shows a sort of policing that was happening on the Palestinian discourse. So what this shows is that who was driving basically the pro-Israeli discourse were the U.S. guests, and the vast majority of U.S. guests were U.S. officials. Well, how does that framing? If you don't have Palestinian voices, you're not going to really have Palestinian frames. So occupation is only mentioned 15 times. By contrast, the word hostages, which is the pro-Israeli sort of frame, was mentioned 529 times, a ratio of 35 to 1 mention of occupation. That amounted to about 10 times that the hostages were brought up per episode. Even though the occupation is arguably the more vital sort of context for understanding what was happening, because it's been ongoing since 1967 and explains the Palestinian political situation much more clearly. Also, Palestinian prisoners were almost not talked about at all, even though the hostages were taken in an effort to obtain freedom for Palestinian prisoners who are effectively hostages as well. Now, there was this other interesting thing that happened, which is that Israel was mentioned twice as often as Hamas was mentioned, which Hamas was mentioned twice as much as Palestinians. This reflected a desire to frame this as a war between Israel and Hamas, but to also not have to talk about the impact of all this on the Palestinian people, who actually bore the brunt, really, of the bombardment and the invasion. So this is a skewed framing that silences Palestinians within the story that's being told, but it's also a result of who got booked as guests. Ceasefire, mentioned 94 times, almost entirely negatively, to shoot down the possibility of a ceasefire, despite it being a major slogan for peace activists and the massive protests that happened in the country, which were almost never talked about on these programs. Genocide is mentioned 23 times, but only once in reference to Gaza. The rest of the times it was mentioned, 20 of the times it was mentioned, were in reference to pro-Palestinian slogans on campuses and in the streets, like "From the river to the sea" or "Free Palestine." So that's when genocide was actually brought up. the deliberate misinterpretation of the slogans as being calls for genocide of the Jews. And this is where you see disinformation really at work, because this is a disinformation campaign to misrepresent the intention behind these slogans. Massacre was only talked about regarding October 7th. So you can see a connection here between the who's booked as guests, who gets sympathy expressed for them on these programs, and then resulting in an imbalance in the framing. Legacy media, I conclude, are still hopelessly elite-driven when it comes to foreign affairs coverage, despite these programs losing viewers and being really kind of out of touch with what's happening on social media, for example, where you're exposed to a completely wider range of views. Some complain about social media users being in bubbles of self-confirming, closed off forums where we can just hear what we want to hear. But actually, TV news is much more clearly the bubble when it comes to the range of discourses that one is exposed to. The failure of this media to serve a proper democratic function is very notable. That only one Palestinian guest appeared on all four of these programs is an astounding failure. But no data point to me is as worrisome as the fact that the pro-Israeli framing is being pushed by the Biden administration and Democratic lawmakers. And not only is this a critique of the media system, but it should also be a critique of our political system, that American officials are not more objective, more neutral, showing more reason in the way they develop their policies and in the way they express the purpose of their policies publicly. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Will. I'll let me join you guys. This is actually pretty thorough, and it'll definitely be something that aligns with our plans of making these teachings assignable in classrooms. This is something that I and my colleagues have been wanting to do, and this is quite instructive. Let's move to our last speaker, Professor Adel Iskandar, who is also part of the collective, and he will be addressing turning points in the Western media coverage of the genocide in Gaza with a question mark. I am very excited as well to be introducing Adel. I will not read the entire bio for everyone, actually, because it will take up a lot of time. Adel Iskandar is an associate professor of global communication at Simon Fraser University. Adel, I was told that it's not the right pronunciation, Fraser. Is that true?
That is correct. That it's not true. It's Fraser, not
Fraser?
Fraser.
Fraser?
Yeah, it's not the show.
Apologies. He's an associate professor of global communications at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Burnaby, Canada. He is the author, co-author, and editor of several works, including Egypt in Flux, Essays on an Unfinished Revolution, Al Jazeera, The Story of the Network That Is Rattling Governments and Redefining Modern Journalism, and Edward Said, Legacy of Emancipation and Representation from University of California Press, Mediating the Arab Uprisings, and Media Evolution and the Eve of the Arab Spring. Iskandar's work deals with media, identity, and politics. He has lectured extensively on these topics at universities worldwide. His forthcoming publications are 2 monographs addressing the political role of memes and digital satire, and the other about contemporary forms of imperial transculturalism. I am very excited to be introducing Adel, a long-term colleague and friend, and also on the project Gaza in Context. Adel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bassam, for the very generous introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to acknowledge and really appreciate listening to both Laila and Will's remarks and research findings. It's a very, very heavy and hefty moment for us to be having this conversation. I want to first start off by acknowledging that I'm joining this call from the unceded and stolen territories of the Coast Salish people, in the Pacific Northwest of this continent. These are the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and others. And I say this in the context of recognizing our continued participation in a settler colonial project. To do so is not just, it's not a figure of speech, it's not a proverb, it's not tokenistic, it is meant to shift our perception of who we are on this land, and also to recognize the continuities and the solidarities in decolonization between the territories on which we reside and on Palestine, ancestral Palestine. Okay, so let's see where can we take this conversation? I think for listeners, this is a lot to reckon with, and it's a lot to watch. I mean, if you've been following the war in Gaza for the last 140 days, I've actually lost track and number at this stage, but you can see that Laila's account of the scale and systematic nature of the attacks, and the disappearance of Palestinian stories, the active process of disappearing Palestinianness, is something that is just mind-blowing and mesmerizing. And then, of course, Will's research that blows away any assumption or claim of journalistic objectivity and impartiality in U.S. network TV news programming. That too is extremely jarring. I want to say that even though my words today are under the title of turning points, as Bassam said, the question mark is probably larger than the title. I will, against my own better judgment, try to focus on the silver linings. But I want to say, by way of disclaimer, that my remarks are not meant to be generalizations, essentializations, or reductions of the particularities and variations in local media markets. My remarks, like Laila and Will's, are dominated by North American examples. Nevertheless, there are more extreme versions of these conditions, and they exist elsewhere in the world. So, for example, in Germany, where criticism of Israel is virtually criminalized, compared to, for example, in the Spanish media, where Palestine solidarity and the tragedies from Gaza are more substantially documented and covered across many platforms. The discrepancies are at times very dramatic. For example, even in the Israeli press, for those who reside in the North American sort of media landscapes, just a glimpse into, let's say, Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which runs articles and opinion pieces that are sometimes critical of the political status quo in Israel and its conduct of the war in Gaza, they might be blown away at how critical sometimes these articles are. And arguably, one might say these articles are unpublishable in the North American press without being either accused or charged with being anti-Semitic, which is the most common and most popular criticism of this type of work. So this is a disclaimer about those types of things. So where are those turning points, and what do they mean? Nothing that I will say should suggest or imply that what Will or Laila's observations and remarks about the egregious failures and professional blunders of mainstream media and the coverage of Israel's crime in Gaza have been repented, or that a seismic shift has taken place to warrant any substantial redress. Instead, my commentary today is an invitation for us to note and perhaps notice the small incremental changes beginning to manifest in the war's coverage and the role that popular anti-war and Palestinian rights activism plays in creating pressures on media organizations, and what that might precipitate in the moment and in the future. So I have about 8 points that I want to raise. The first is, and some of these might sound intuitive to those of us who are following this closely, or even for individuals who are actively involved in Palestine activism, but nevertheless, I will point them out. And to each of these, there is also criticism, but I think I want to raise them nevertheless. The first is what I believe is the dramatic localization of the conflict. So from a foreign political, the conflict is obviously situated in Palestine, Israel, and it has gone substantially from a foreign political problem to a domestic national one over a span of, 4 to 5 months. So, and it actually has trickled down into local community news. The stubbornness of the Palestinian rights movement, the anti-war organizing, has made the story local. And I say that by way of examples such as, national protests and rallies and port blockages and letter writing and petitions and interruptions of political elite at all levels, from federal government to municipal city government. Pressure from constituents on elected officials happening everywhere, even if it's a short interruption of the regular state of affairs. Communities have often disparately and disconnectedly come together and coalesced in organizing calls for ceasefires from towns to metropolises, from coast to coast across North America. Now, of course, when we look at the media, we have to understand the levels and the hierarchies, not just in the manner in which power is situated, but also geographically. Local media, from community newspapers and radio stations to affiliates of public broadcasting and network television, including local digital news available on social media platforms, often find themselves unable to ignore the local angle of the story, whether it's Muslim, Arab, Black, Indigenous, Progressive, Jewish, Latinx alliances and their activation and or civil disobedience happening in the local communities. A lot of this started out as or was being cast and represented as antisocial, radical political voices that needed to be demonized in the press. But in over 100 days, that coverage has begun to shift because of the sheer volume and pressure and resilience of these movements. It's very difficult to continue to demonize the exact same people in the same way with the same narratives over and over and over again. And so, even though this might seem to be little cracks in a system, we may not be able to see it on a global level in terms of like the large sort of national broadcasters, but in small media markets, it's starting to make a difference. Now, of course, the competition over these media narratives and the representations of these voices often comes down to whose tragedy is greater, whose narrative should preside and prevail, and unfortunately, what has happened is it started to pit community members against each other. So, staunch Zionist communities versus, Palestinian or anti-war kind of protesters, and the community publications, newspapers, and networks, including local community radio, has had to reckon with some of this. In the many media markets, this has not manifested, as I said, but in others, there has been substantial normalization of Palestinian rights and acceptance of criticism of Israel policy, even when it doesn't have a substantial footprint in the broadcast. But nevertheless, the existence of these voices at a local level has rendered the discussion a lot more problematic and a lot more difficult to subdue. The second point that I wanted to raise is the role of Gaza and electoral politics. The organization and growth of the protest movement has forced media organizations to factor their stories if in Israel's war in Gaza as an agenda item in electoral politics. Usually, foreign policy matters, as Will has described, is something that through the indexing model and others, is a matter relinquished entirely to government policy. And of course, we turn to the State Department. You'll see that State Department typically dictates how one should see or understand conflicts around the world, and the U.S. government tends to help us understand and filter how we perceive these types of situations. But what happens when these conflicts come home? And by coming home, I mean literally they become an agenda item for constituents across the country. The one that comes to mind, of course, is the discussion around Michigan and Dearborn, or communities of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans across the country who have been taking protests to the streets and to their elected officials quite regularly. But I would argue that it is far more generalized and far more national than we might assume. The interruptions by protesters of prominent politicians, from Joe Biden to Nancy Pelosi. I mean, virtually every politician has to reckon with the possibility of having their rallies, their events, their fundraisers potentially interrupted by pro-ceasefire or anti-genocide or pro-Palestinian protests. And that's something that has made it impossible for local media to continue to ignore it. Hence, the media agenda is being reset, not necessarily at the very top, but on the ground reporting level. They can ignore it day in and day out, but nevertheless, sometimes the story dominates. We see that with, for example, the Grammys or other notable moments of television, spectacular moments of television viewership, as well as moments of national fandom, if you will. The third point that I wanted to raise is with regards to the dramatic globalization of the conflict. So it is very easy for the conflict to be perceived in a very sort of singular manner, and through one vantage point or one lens, if it happens to be localized in a particular geographical space. But what happens when a story becomes globalized, in the sense that all stories everywhere, somehow, in the last 100 days, have led back to Gaza? From coverage of sports events to climate activism, from coverage of other countries across the Middle East to North America to Western Europe, stories about gas prices, international trade, logistics, Yemen, Lebanon, Iran, China, Russia, all deliberations at major international intergovernmental agencies lead back to Gaza, where it's issues pertaining to the well being of children, water scarcity, food shortages, activism against arms proliferation, or international law. Gaza remains a top item on the agenda, even at COP28 in the United Arab Emirates, where activism is essentially criminalized and the Abraham Accords have been consecrated and normalization of Israel is now part of public life. Pro Palestine protests took place on the conference grounds and even interrupted the closing session. There is hardly a country in this world where discussions about Gaza don't dominate coverage of international relations and national politics in those specific markets, making it difficult for Western media reporting in those places, in those countries, about their local politics and their local circumstances to continue to neglecting these antipodian angles on the war. And I want to say that this is, as the war begins to become more regionalized or perhaps globalized, with various players being part of it, it's very difficult for the Western media to continue to ignore what appear to be these marginal and tangential angles that lead back to Gaza. The fourth is the news cycles and journalism's presentism. It should come as no surprise to anyone that journalism is fetishistically obsessed with the present. That is a cornerstone of journalistic practice in the 21st century. With the dizzying pace of news cycles, reporting moves from one story to the next, one crisis to the next, one locale to the next. While this has already begun to happen vis-a-vis the war in Gaza, where reporting is beginning to dwindle, particularly past the 100-day mark since its commencement, the presentism of the media has had an unanticipated, in my opinion, unanticipated effect on what narratives and stories see the limelight. With Hamas's attacks on Israel dominating the airwaves for a substantial amount of time since October 7th, the escalation and scale of violence by Israel in Gaza has made it difficult to keep reminding people of Hamas's atrocities on October 7th, as the scale of atrocities by Israel far outnumber and far outweigh and far outsize anything that Hamas has done on October 7th. Now, of course, it becomes necessary for what Will described, whether it's the agenda setting or the very sort of like elite power based models of restricting access to Palestinian voices in the media. But nevertheless, Israel has to continue to produce new breaking stories like the UNRWA employees and others to be able to recast the news cycle and introduce new present crises. But nevertheless, there have been breakages and breakdowns in this arrangement, and I would suggest that in moving forward, as we begin to explore the fallout of what has happened in Gaza, these stories will continue to emerge and begin to essentially fill our airwaves, even if it's longer form journalism as opposed to breaking news stories. The fifth point is with regards to newsroom pressure. The Columbia Journalism Review just published an article that, I'm going to just read a particular quote that I quite liked. It says, "Indeed, nothing in recent memory has riven newsrooms the way this war has. Unlike the George Floyd protests of 2020 or the Russian-Ukraine war, the issue of the war in Gaza has deeply divided newsrooms and uniquely endangered journalists." And in the case of the LA Times, journalists who signed open letters criticizing how American media cover the war and protesting of killing of journalists by Israeli forces have been barred from reporting it for the next 3 months. The weaponization of journalistic objectivity to shut down any sympathies for Palestinians, as described by both Laila and Will, has been extraordinary, as countless journalists in the West have either seen their work be heavily edited or themselves been rendered redundant by expressing any concern for the well-being of Gazans. Countless journalists have been forced out of their jobs, taken off their beats, or reprimanded for such expressions, whether these manifest professionally or personally. These are considered violations of the cardinal rule of objectivity. However, the double standard clearly debunks the myth of objectivity, as expressions of sympathy by journalists and editors, producers, and other media professionals across all platforms and broadcasters, both professional and personal, for the victims of the October 7th attacks have been universally accepted and air without any concern or equivocation. Furthermore, the call for fairness and balance is perennially deployed whenever Palestinians' voices exist by introducing another side of the story. Every Palestinian voice must be balanced with an Israeli one, and every Palestinian supporter must be countered by a Zionist one, whether to counter false charges of anti-Semitism or because of institutional bias. This practice of two-siding every narrative of Palestinian suffering often results in Palestinian silencing. So where's the turning point here? This is, I'm still sharing this kind of pessimistic view. The sheer volume of reporters and journalists wanting to tell stories unfiltered and unadulterated has caused reverse pressure on the editorial staff and management of media. Just 2 days ago, The Guardian reported that CNN staff are challenging their network on its pro-Israel slant and are calling it journalistic malpractice, in quotes. But this pressure has been mounting. As far back as November 9th, a little over a month after the commencement of the conflict, 750 journalists from dozens of news organizations signed a letter protesting the media's coverage of the war. AFP journalists rallied for colleagues blocked in Gaza. Media workers have protested the New York Times. 300 Australian journalists signed a petition against official media's pro-Israel stance on Gaza. LGBTQ2+ writers left the New York Times over Gaza's coverage. ABC in Australia's federal politics reporter quit the Australian broadcaster over Gaza coverage. BBC journalists penned a letter complaining about their broadcaster's coverage, and the list goes on and on and on. In February, now over 4 months since the war has started, editors, producers, media managers are all being called on to explain their editorial decisions and choices throughout the past months. You may not be seeing it just yet, but as Laila mentioned, what will this look like moving forward? In the same way that we saw a reckoning with Western American coverage of the war in Iraq, this too is on the horizon. The sixth is the death of colleagues. As Laila said, there's been little to no expressed sympathy for the death and killing of Palestinian journalists, of which I think we're talking about 85 journalists and media workers, 78 Palestinians. The numbers might be more than that at this point, but the silence in the face of this systematic attack against journalists or anyone able to document these atrocities by mainstream media has been totally shocking. That said, cracks in the system emerge when news organizations their own reporters, their own workers are themselves targeted, or when it happens live. And there have been instances of that more specifically. In the case of CNN, they had to interrupt regular coverage to account for an attack against one of their own. And you can imagine how jarring that was for viewers of CNN that are accustomed to a very, very sedated, repetitive, and continuous chorus of support for Israel. And of course, you bring on the Israeli military spokesperson, and they don't really have an answer to it. But at the same time, there's a humanized story of a reporter or a worker at CNN who has to explain how they became targets. So these interruptions are perhaps few and far between, but are nevertheless really important. Past the 100 days of the conflict, the atrocities are starting to make their way into the mainstream press, perhaps as a small trickle, but gradually solidarity and the emboldening of journalists across Western media perhaps could consecrate new realities. The seventh point is with regards to the power of social media, and honestly, this would require its own teaching. So the only thing I'm going to say is that the growing irrelevance of legacy media is upon us. Demographic shifts in media use and consumption, the newsification of Instagram and TikTok, media no longer are necessary, or legacy media are no longer necessary as intermediaries. Journalists on the ground in Gaza supplant foreign correspondents. Local and native journalists seem more reliable, particularly to young folks. Folks don't want necessarily to hear from the parachuted foreign correspondent who will come in, tell us a story, and then walk out. And then finally, I want to say a quick word about how legacy media feel like they might have been left out in the dark. Like anything, mainstream media, in at least in North America, tend to be private news organizations, and the most important thing for them is having eyeballs both on their screens, but also following their social media platforms and the amount of viewership and sharing and liking of the content that they distribute in terms of short video packages online. What happens when a single journalist based in Gaza has more followers than the New York Times's own social media platforms? What happens if an influencer based in suburban Chicago has more followers than the LA Times? This is how the future of journalism is going to be shaped, through the proliferation of short videos. So for the mainstream legacy media to be part of this, they now recognize that there's substantial profit potentially in having eyeballs on the content that they're producing. And they realize there's a substantial appetite for coverage of Palestine that is at least level headed and even handed, and perhaps at most sympathetic to the Palestinians as they face genocide. So, however, with the ubiquity of video cameras in Gaza and the use of drones and the occasional trickle of Western reporting, news is getting out. And we'll see what the media will do when when all of this continues. Having said that, even though the war seems to be perhaps slowing down, or the scale and the scope of the killing, well, that's not almost 30 seconds. The scale seems to be slowing down. The What we're dealing with now is the mass starvation of 2.3 million people. What that looks like for news, is that breaking news? How will it be discussed in the press? We have yet to discover. But the majority of the Gaza Strip has been destroyed. The slow demise and death of Gazans may not draw as much media attention or allow media cameras to shift to conflicts or tragedies du jour, but nevertheless, the shifting of the news media agenda and the gatekeeping, the solid fortified gatekeeping that we're accustomed to seeing from mainstream media is beginning, in my opinion, to crack, and institutional pressures are perhaps coming in from within and from outside, as opposed to from above, as we're usually used to. Thank you.
Thank you, Adel. You actually have 62 more minutes if you'd like to take them. You actually compensated for the disproportional coverage that features the Israeli perspective in part. So thank you very much, Adel. I just wanted to get to the some of the questions. Really appreciate your take and the insights you bring forth. We definitely need more than one such event, even though this is our second media teach-in. Thank you all so much. I know that I've kept you already for 2 hours. I mean, for 1 hour. Sorry, I just thought that Adil's with 1 hour long. And I would like to ask Laila a question, which kind of brings us back to the title that was shared by Adel, in terms of there being any positive examples that you can discern of media coverage to come out recently, relatively recently, and what might be a space or place for hope going forward in terms of portrayal, coverage, and so on, even in mainstream media.
Thank you for that. I think I just wanted to kind of echo what Adel said, which is that we see less of a dominance by some of these corporate mainstream media outlets that we've mentioned, the major US networks, CNN, the cable news networks, and the major newspapers. Of course, there are certain examples of coverage in the New York Times and the Washington Post that I think we should support, because when you talk about what is fair coverage when it comes to what's happening to Palestinians, it's literally just factually reporting what's happening to them. Palestinians are not asking for spin or for undeserved sympathy, but rather just factual reporting. And I notice even myself, not just as a journalist, but as a media consumer, when I'm watching or listening or reading something and I'm thinking, wow, that they're doing a good job with this, it's usually literally just factual. And I think that's how far we have to go So we saw, for example, just last week, the Washington Post did a really detailed piece about Hind, the young girl in Gaza who was trapped in her family's vehicle, and her older sister had called the Palestinian Red Crescent and said, please, come rescue us. The Israeli military is shooting at us. And then, the line then cut out. And we later learned that the crew that came with the Palestinian Red Crescent to rescue Hind is now missing, and Hind herself, no one has heard from them. So they're all presumed dead. But it was a very detailed look at that. So we do see the New York Times visual investigations team oftentimes, and I think it's no coincidence that tends to be, more balanced, more fair, more factual than some of these journalists who parachute in and kind of launder Israeli government talking points. They've done some pretty good work on the targeting of Palestinian homes and infrastructure. As Adel mentioned, the fact that you have social media now, you have people from Gaza being able to tell their own stories, somebody like Mu'taz, Bisan, Plestia, being able to amass such a large following is very encouraging. But on the flip side of that, you also see censorship and shadow banning by social media companies. So I think it's something that we can be cautiously optimistic about, because even though it's very encouraging that these news organizations have lost their monopoly, you also see the social media companies kind of trying to take control of the narrative. You see the CEO of TikTok being brought in on the Hill to testify, and kind of this moral panic of our children are being subjected to misinformation because of the fact that on TikTok you see videos and narratives that are much more sympathetic to the Palestinian side. So I think we should all be very guarded on the fact that, social media companies at the end of the day are companies, and they have the power in terms of what access people can have to information. So I would say those are and of course you see Al Jazeera kind of regaining relevance, being the major broadcaster on the ground in Gaza. But, as I mentioned earlier, Wael al-Dahdouh, Al Jazeera's correspondent in Gaza, his family was killed. He himself was injured in an attack. He has been threatened consistently. His cameraman, Samir Abu Daqqa, was killed. So you see that Al Jazeera, as the main international organization on the ground in Gaza, has faced tremendous pressure. We saw reports from earlier on of the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken actually pressuring Qatar to ask Al Jazeera to tone down its coverage as well. So in a way, this has been very much a mask-off moment in terms of the U.S. government as well and its values. You hear a lot about the importance of freedom of speech and expression and free media, but then on the flip side, you see Blinken pressuring Al Jazeera to tone down coverage, whatever that means. So I think in all of that respect, you do see some glimmers of hope. You also see polling showing that the vast majority of Americans actually support a ceasefire. The vast majority, or not vast majority, but majority, the vast majority of Democrats support a ceasefire. And despite all of this pro-Israel media coverage, the polling is actually showing that there's growing sympathy for Palestinians and for their cause. So it shows that even in the face of all of this pro-Israel coverage, slanted coverage, that people are finding access to information that kind of puts a dent in that.
Thank you, Laila. I have other questions, but I'll move to Will, and we might have a question or two from the audience. Will, again, thanks for your presentation and PowerPoint. A lot of people have found it very interesting and instructive. But my question is, given that you've written a book on Al Jazeera America, which was a temporary project, and then it had to shut down, can you tell us in general about Al Jazeera and Al Jazeera's role in this in covering the war on Gaza?
Yeah, thank you. I would just add to what Laila was talking about in terms of Jazeera having an exceptional presence on the ground in Gaza and being able to produce some of the best journalism on the ground. And that's been the case since 2008, 2009, and every Israeli invasion and bombardment since then. Jazeera has been the most important source of information in each of those horrific episodes. Now, I would say something that we learned with Al Jazeera America closing in part was the failure to understand how little general public interest there is in foreign affairs reporting or international reporting. I think that Jazeera made a bet that they could, that there would be this appetite in a larger American public for news about the world. And this is actually conventional wisdom in the news industry, and it does to some degree play out, but it's also a chicken and egg problem. You have news media that think that, and then they cover it less, and the public has less knowledge and less appetite. So there, I think the Al Jazeera's failure in the U.S. might indicate, at least for a certain generation of Americans, that aren't really tapped into the world and are very sort of conservative. And that's actually kind of the audience for these talk shows that I was talking about. They're older audiences, they're whiter audiences, they're higher income audiences, but they tend to vote and they tend to give money to campaigns. They tend to have a little bit more political influence and have a more prominent voice. But I do think, I do agree with a lot of the analysis of Laila and Adel about all these exciting things are happening on the ground, and there's all this new sources of information are happening, that the Israelis are often on the defensive and they have to manufacture talking points and crises in order to stay ahead of the news curve, and to try to control the narrative because they face so many threats to it. Certainly that's kind of in many ways unprecedented. I mean, I've never seen Israel have to be on the defensive so much as they've had here. But this is also, as a matter of many times of degrees, like the bloodiest thing they've done in a long time. So yeah, to go back to the question of optimism, there's cracks, and the youth are energized and mobilized, but like also think about what Israel's actually doing and getting away with. Like there should be zero support for that. So the fact that there isn't zero support is something that's really worrisome, and I think it has to do with Americans being so insular, not and also being racist or Islamophobic and not wanting to sympathize, and then also just generations and generations of pro-Israeli propaganda. And when Al Jazeera was trying to build an audience in the U.S., these were some of the same obstacles that they were coming against: ignorance, prejudice, partisanship, a natural sort of knee-jerk tendency to just defer to Israel and see what Israel's doing is right. And that's not just because of the pro-Israel lobby as we traditionally understand it, AIPAC and so on, but also the rise of Christian Zionism, which is a huge political force in this country and based on a rationale that you can't possibly argue with because it's scriptural and religious and that kind of thing. So the political culture of the U.S. that was hostile to Al Jazeera is also the political culture that's going to support Israel genocide, to the end, essentially. And that feels like a very immovable force in U.S. politics. But I think that, as Adel pointed out, there are bases for hope and there are things to sort of build on. And I think that once the news media ecosystem's metamorphosis is complete and the realization of this market for Palestinian or pro-Palestinian content becomes unavoidable, that we might see a more balanced out media ecosystem. But yeah, so I'm trying to connect Al Jazeera to some of the points that were being made, and I do encourage. I think that most of the people watching this probably do watch it, but I'm constantly surprised by people who just discover Al Jazeera English's coverage. It's like, where have you been?
And it's available on YouTube free of charge, 24/7, high quality broadcasting.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you want to? Okay. Thank you. Thanks for this. Well, Adel, we're gonna skip you. No, I'm joking. I want to ask you a question, Adel, but I would like also others to answer if it's possible before we break or before we move on to other questions, depending on how quickly we can address this. One of the things that we have been doing at the Gaza and Context Project is think about basically future activities and projects that have to do with what is going on in Gaza. And we have come to the realization that one day the killing will diminish, if not completely stop. And a lot of people will go back to quote unquote life / work and so on. So we are hoping to actually do something, given that at the end of this carnage, of this genocide, the problem compared to other cases, even in previous cases in which Israel devastated Gaza in 2008, December 2008, January 2009, 2012, 2014, 2021, the resumption of life was far more doable. Today, the resumption of life is almost completely obstructed because of the uninhabitable towns and cities and homes and neighborhoods. So we are looking to actually continue with our coverage with a project that is provisionally titled "Lest We Forget: Memory and Rebuilding in Gaza." And in reference to this thinking, or this type of thinking, which actually is premised on the fact that attention already has dropped, even those who are completely concerned and devastated. So my question is, what would you estimate might happen when the media cycle sort of moves on in response to that, and when there's some sort of fatigue or saturation? I mean, there are different levels, of course, of attention and care and concern, but then there are different levels of tolerance, and then there's the market and what drives putting stories on legacy media specifically. What happens then, and will this genocide be forgotten? Sorry, that's a lot of things.
How much time do you have?
This time I'm not going to use the
You're
Jamaica
gonna shut
bell.
off my mic.
I'm going to actually do what they did at the BBC when somebody was addressing the atrocities committed by Israel. They actually cut the microphone.
Okay,
I
let
won't
me
do
try
that.
not to get my mic muted. I think this is the real struggle, is to figure out what happens moving forward. I want to say very quickly that I think that one of the reasons why I believe that the discussion around Gaza is not going to go away easily is because the kind of activation that has happened since these atrocities began. You have to remember that, I don't know where I read this. I'll have to pull it up. But someone said that 86%, of course, a lot of statistics are made up on the spot, but I genuinely believe that if we were to conduct a survey of protesters, folks who are protesting for Palestinian rights or actually calling for a ceasefire, most of these individuals have never protested before. People have been activated into this protest movement for the very first time, and it's happening nationwide or around the world. Activation into a protest movement is a matter of collective literacy, and it's also a transformative experience for those who've participated in it. And I say this because I think it is a kind of a confounding moment where connections have been built, communities have been created, and this is not going to go away easily, in the sense that these communities will continue to produce pressure points. Even if the journalistic coverage, I mean, we often refer to journalism as the first draft of history. The first draft of history, as Laila very accurately described, as well as through Will's research, has been abysmal. So this requires and demands a revisionist history, and all of these individuals who are part of this massive and billowing and growing movement are going to continue to push for a revision of this history. In fact, the revision of this history might not come in the form of journalism. It'll come in the form of articles, longer form articles. It'll come in the form of research studies that will be published by Will and others. It'll come out in the form of the more literary works manuscripts, stories, narratives. You can imagine the tens of thousands of people who have been impacted by the war, including many in the Palestinian diaspora. These individuals will have lots of stories to tell. When you think about the impact of the stories from Nakba, even though there was very limited documentation then, today we're talking about hundreds of hours worth of footage, that has yet to leave Gaza. So you keep in mind that the volume of this stuff is we're only just touching the surface. So it's going to be very difficult for the media to ignore this indefinitely. Even if the news cycle doesn't pick it up or we don't see those upticks, it is a matter of lengthy attrition. The other thing too is that the one of the reasons why we have these situations and these sort of blockades against Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices in the media is because of the very staunch pro-Israeli watchdogs. It's kind of like the elephant in the room. But nowadays we've got massive mobilizations that are playing the role of watchdogs to these watchdogs, kind of exposing them for their failure to tell truths or for manufacturing falsities and pushing for bias in the media. So the challenges are happening to this structural system on all fronts. And I will say that I think it's important for us to acknowledge that, not unlike the civil rights movement, we have at the forefront of the calls for justice for Palestinians and end to the war, incredible Jewish voices and critics of Israel, and they too have an axe to grind now. They are being tarnished, they're being marginalized, they're being criminalized, they're being racialized. It's quite incredible, and for them, this struggle is only just starting. Many of them have joined this movement in the last 100 days. So what I mean to say is that the debate and the discussion will continue. You will be reminded by what happened in Rwanda. To this day, the Rwandan genocide continues to be an exemplar. It is far from forgotten, and I would say, and I would argue that the genocide in Gaza will also continue to be the case, especially as it makes its way not only through the ICC and potentially the ICC, but in court systems around this country and around the world. So I imagine that there will be stories upon stories upon stories moving in the future. We just have to continue to recognize the complexity and diversity of the movements, foregrounding the allyship and solidarity, but also focus our efforts, both as scholars and journalists and reporters, on being able to narrate those stories where we can, when we can, even if there is an active blockade to prevent it from being the case. And also to bring up Gaza in every and any possibility when given a chance to speak to power, that we bring forth Gaza. So I just wanted to throw these things out there. But as a last point, I want to say that exactly 4 months ago, when one would discuss Palestine and Palestinianness, the response, the most common response is, what is Palestine? Who are the Palestinians? The misconstruing of the word Palestine with Pakistan was kind of a regular joke on on comedy shows. But today, all of this is far from being the case.
Thanks, Adel. Laila, you spoke the least, so you can take your time.
I think thinking back on this moment, or looking back on this moment, many people have been politicized in a way they never thought was possible. I think just seeing the discrepancy between, again, the images and videos and reports of horror that we see from Gaza, compared with the inaction and complicity and complacence of our political leaders and the biased media coverage, has really awakened something in people and has broken something in people that I think they will be reckoning with for a very long time. And I think about the words of Maya Angelou, who said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think, given how long this has gone on and the scale of atrocities, I don't believe that people will forget how they felt during this time. Just friends of mine, people in my circle, but also people outside of my circle, talk about how they can't sleep or eat, or the depression that they feel. And these are people who are not even Palestinian. I think something has broken in people, and this will go on and this will continue. And maybe I'm being overly optimistic now, but I think people will continue speaking about it and trying to bear witness when they can. And I think this will affect Biden in the election. I imagine these protests that follow him everywhere he goes will continue. People have been camped out not far from my own home in front of the Secretary of State Blinken's house for nearly 2 weeks now, to the point where just today, the his security detail kicked them off of the side of the street closest to the house to build a massive security perimeter. They closed down the entire street and the bridge near his home. So people are having an impact. They have been affected. This will continue. And I think what Israel wants is for people to forget. What Israel wants is for the media coverage to stop. But it's also up to journalists to do their jobs and to document the atrocities once Gaza is finally open, if that's ever the case, and to go back and actually investigate the war crimes, of which there are ample that have happened, and to make sure that they are documented for the world to see, because that's the least that journalists can do if they're serious about doing their jobs.
Thank you. Will?
So to go back to your original question about kind of memory and preservation, and yeah, it's hard because I keep thinking about just the scale of destruction in Gaza and what's happening now, and it's just so hard to imagine that there's a future to look, a future that we need to think about when it's just we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Just thinking about the struggle of people to find shelter or food, and just the sheer barbarity of targeting ambulances or bombing tents. Yeah, it's just overwhelming to think about. Yeah, what's going to happen when this is all said and done? Where are Palestinians going to be? I try to be optimistic, but I feel that things are just going to get worse. The U.S. political system is just so deep in the tank for Israel. And I think that militarily, things they'll go to the map for them, and it could be regional explosion.
Do you think the media cycle is going to follow every single media cycle? Say, for instance, after the invasion of Iraq, those of us who were living then and following everything in 2003 and 4, around 2005 we began to see a serious dip. So you think we're going to see this sort of dip even faster?
Well, it's an election year, so as much as the election can be disconnected from what's happening in Gaza, then the U.S. is just
it's not like we're connected to anything that's happening there.
They have a way of construing it as such. Although, if Trump decided to be clever and realize that, wow, I could actually destroy Biden in the swing states by making just slightly better comments on Gaza, then it could sort of be brought into the election. But who's really gonna trust Trump on Gaza? He'll just be cynical, So yeah, I don't have much hope, but yeah, it's about the grassroots. It's about not just our Jewish allies, but our allies of color, like the 2 Northwestern students who they just were trying to go after and arrest for putting out that spoof newspaper. Were 2 Black students. And I'm consistently impressed by Black Americans just speaking out and constantly being repressed for it, being basically told to go back and know their place. So there's some hope in that. But when I think about the defense complex and the sort of way they financially profit from wars, and the push to target Iran, and the way they respond to the Houthis, yeah, I do fear that it's going to get worse in the region militarily before it gets better.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank
so
you.
Sorry to be pessimistic about everything.
I mean, this is the consensus in a way.
Yeah. But our memory, it's there in our memory. Gaza's never going to leave our memory. This is a completely formative moment.
Well,
it's going to shape these generations to come.
Yeah, and it's also about the manifestation of this memory in public space, which actually is the issue, because the memory is, yeah, absolutely there. One question for you, Will, from somebody in the audience, asking if you have conducted this type of study that you have addressed today before October 7th and
Not
before.
immediately before, but there are a lot of different studies about looking at sort of similar biases in framing and sourcing, not just by me, but others, like Marta Dunsky, for example. I'm working on a paper now that's looking at 2006, the war on Hezbollah, and it identifies a lot of similar themes and framing, just to show that this is a systematic phenomenon.
Okay.
So there's a lot of previous research that you can baseline it with, but I like the question, and that's given me some ideas for future research.
Thank you. I want to ask Laila one last question, and then we will wrap up. And I hate to do this, but I'm gonna sound like an NPR person asking a question on NPR, because these are the kinds of questions that we hear a lot. But I actually want to ask you because of like your the space in which you are dwelling. Um, what actually, given that we know that there is a remarkable bias historically, which is repeated over and over, what still surprised you in this particular, uh, you know, carnage about reporting on the war on Gaza?
It's a good question. I think in some ways I wasn't surprised, but I think just the scale of fabrication and people's willingness to kind of put their own ideological beliefs. And I think about people like Jake Tapper on CNN or Dana Bash, who are just very nakedly like taking Israeli government talking points that are being funneled to them, and having these like hours on end, wall to wall coverage of, essentially repeating these Israeli government talking points. Jake Tapper writing a piece, putting his name on this piece, saying that Al Shifa Hospital is a Hamas command and control node. When, weeks later, of course, every doctor that had anything to do with Al Shifa Hospital, the UN, everybody's saying that's not true. The Israeli government, Ehud Barak telling Christiane Amanpour, we built those tunnels under that hospital. Facts just really have no space in this kind of, so-called journalism. It's really just propaganda and state stenography. I think just the level that people are willing to go to just do propaganda has been pretty stunning. The New York Times has been called out for this Screams Without Words piece I mentioned about alleged mass rape. And rather than do a real thorough investigation of what I think is one of the most embarrassing and journalistically unsound pieces I've seen in recent memory, they actually assigned the same reporters who wrote that initial piece to basically go back, re-interview people they talked to. Those people were like, nope, I told you the truth. And that somehow passes for a post-mortem. I mean, it's really stunning, the level of journalistic malpractice, of bias, of just these patterns of really dehumanizing reporting. It just, like I said, and now the lead up to the war in Iraq almost pales in comparison, just given the scale and given sort of this disconnect between the atrocities, the daily war crimes that we see reported from Gaza, and the lack of coverage. I think books can be written about it. I think a lot about how the work of Edward Said continues to be relevant. And I really hope someone takes up that mantle and writes a book really dissecting the media failures that we see right now.
Thank you, Laila. Adel, can you say one thing, one as in واحد, one thing that surprised you?
One thing that surprised me, I think everything about this surprises me. The scale of the destruction,
No,
the
the media reporting. Yeah.
yeah, the media reporting, everything about it is surprising. It's just as Layla said, it's a complete disaster. It is blunders that have yet to be understood. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen coverage that is so utterly repugnant and completely committed to the dehumanization, the collective dehumanization of a people. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that. It is truly mind blowing. So everything about it is preposterous in every sense of the word.
I
So it's not one thing; it's the whole thing. It's all one.
and those of us who actually, like myself, who are probably older than you guys, who have actually watched Peter Arnett in 1990 cover the second war, the second Gulf War, even though we call it the first Gulf War. We've seen these sorts of biases. I mean, it's to be expected. It's not like it's only done here. But what we are...
I want to interrupt you. The difference between Peter Arnett and coverage of CNN during that period and now is that there actually is a counter narrative. There is volumes of content, video, and footage
Yeah,
from the ground that is actively being ignored, right?
yeah.
So in the past, there was literally no reporting on the ground. Today, the sheer volume of content being produced out of Gaza far outscale
Absolutely.
everything that is coming from outside of it. So this is
Absolutely.
an active effort to completely shut down any information coming from the ground, which is the opposite.
Absolutely. But what I'm saying is actually worse than that. I'm saying in the absence of a counter narrative, it was still nowhere near where we're at right now. And you know, Peter Arnett may have been the better of the pack, or the lesser problematic of the pack, and it's actually a case study that I think people like yourselves will be addressing, and others who are entering this realm, which is now expanding, will be addressing for years and decades to come. Will, you have the last word on what might have been surprising still, given what we already know.
Well, it's hard to say that anything's surprising, but it's shocking. Surprising because we know about the levers of power and the biases, the personal biases of people. But yeah, I've just been sort of shocked by how just, I guess, how extreme the reliance on narrow set of sources, like just what a violation of the basic things that we teach students to do in journalism. And but it's also so structural. It's not just these bad actors. I mean, I think everyone should read the Guardian piece on CNN to see how an institution's been totally corrupted from the top down in order to produce ideologically driven coverage. And it's just really a case study in an absolute institutional failure. Like Laila, I just found myself being more surprised when there were moments of actual neutrality. In my study, I found that some of the guests were actually just saying, we're just being neutral, and I found that even so refreshing. But yeah, it was just that became the exception. I mean, when neutrality is the exception, you have a problem.
Thank you so much, Will. Thanks to everyone here. I really appreciate all of your commentary and insights, and I am sorry that I kept you much longer than I shared. 75 minutes. We're about 25 over that. Sorry to everyone who has. I've been looking to the left and right at other screens.
All these sorries, I appreciate all these sorries.
Yeah, we have to be accountable, because I asked people to send a couple of questions, and we couldn't take more than one or two, which I tried to weave into some of what I shared.
We went longer than we were supposed to too, so we
yes, well, I'll compensate you with nice words. That's why all the sorries, Will, and I hope that we can continue this conversation even down the line. I mean, there will be a time when we can look back and assess the answer to the question of what is likely to happen after this particular moment begins to lapse. Thank you all again. Thanks to everyone who's viewing. Thanks to all of the I always say collaborators. It doesn't sound good given the Palestine context. Thanks to all those who co-sponsored and organized these events, these teach-ins. We will be resuming next week with teach-ins on one of the ones that had to be canceled because the speaker fell ill. It will be on present, absent, basically on the condition of Palestinians in Palestinian citizens in Israel. And we also will be addressing other matters that feel free to join by taking a look at Palestinian context, where we address upcoming events. Shukran to everybody and have a wonderful time. Salam.